So I'm joined by Dan Attrell and David Porreca. So thanks both of you for coming on. Just so we can distinguish your voices, because this won't be video. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And David, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much, James, for having us on your show.
That's okay. There we go. Now we're sort of distinguished. Your voices are quite alike, so it's actually quite tough. We are going to be discussing Picatrix, or some people might call it the Picatrix, but this is the Magic in History version, published by... Who are the publishers?
Pennsylvania State University Press.
Okay. Which is Picatrix, a medieval treatise on astral magic, translated with an introduction by Dan Attrell and David Porreca. So you both were involved in the translation process.
Yes, very much so. It was a team effort, and I did the first very rough draft, and Dan Englished it very ably, and then we both went through the entire text several times together, and it was a labor of love on both sides, I think, and it's a pleasure to have it done and out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how did it come about that it, how did it come about, and how did it come about that it got picked up by Magic in History? Because I've been trying to get some of the authors from this series on, because this whole series of Magic in History is seriously impressive. So how did this come about? And this seems to be one of the really popular ones from this series as well.
Well, I've known that there's been a need for an English translation for this for a long time. I think John Michael Greer and Christopher Warnock both they started their project at the same time as I started translating, unknowingly, one to the other. They finished theirs much sooner because of my involvement in university administration in the meantime. It was a struggle to find the time to work on this, so it took several years. And along the way, Dan got on board as research assistant, and then his contribution became undeniable, and we are currently have become co-authors on it, and quite rightly so. Dan also wrote the bulk of the introduction. So, hats off. Thank you for your help, Dan. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
So, David, you're in academia. Are you a lecturer or professor?
I'm associate professor in classical studies at the University of Waterloo. I'm the medievalist in that department. So I'm teaching the post-classical world, but pre-modern. Latin has been my main focus, and it makes sense to be translating the Latin Picatrix rather than its Arabic original, which a colleague of ours in London is currently working on at the moment, Liana Saif.
Oh, wow. And Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it you do?
So right now I am one of David's graduate students. I'm doing my PhD in Western esotericism. I'm writing a dissertation on apocalypticism and Platonism, and how these currents intertwine in the Renaissance and in how people think about history, and the role that prophetic thinking and Platonic philosophy have had in generating our maps of time, essentially. So that's what I'm working on right now. And then, of course, I also do the Modern Hermeticist podcast, I guess you could call it. It's more of a collection of things like audiobooks and lectures and interviews. So that's mostly what I do, is research and translation and podcasting, much like you do. And that's more or less what I'm about.
Sounds good. I guess this question would be for both of you. I mean, I guess it's tough for any of us to really answer it correctly because it's completely within my bias as well. But it seems to me that there's a real resurgence within esotericism, specifically Western esotericism. So do you two see that as well?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah, the success of the Magic in History series at Penn State Press is an indication that it's even sort of blowing into the sales on the academic side too. The Scholarly Society for the Study of Magic, known as the Societas Magica, it has been going for 25 years, and it's going strong. So that it's happening both on the academic as well as on the practitioner side of esoterica.
Yeah, and I think also there's just a kind of world weariness with the new age that came about maybe in the 2000s, when people started to become a little bit more skeptical about some of the ideas that were floating around in there. And they wanted to get a sense of how these ideas came about. What is the true chronology of these ideas? How do we think about these things in a historical framework, as opposed to these, immemorial ideas that are disembodied and floating around in the realm of forms. So I think that it's been a lot of that. If you look at something like the work of Wouter Hanegraaff, who, if you can, you should try to get on your show. He, I think, launched his career looking at the New Age and the history of the New Age, and then eventually got into studying Western esotericism and what is esotericism. And that's kind of spawned this whole Amsterdam school of thinking about esotericism as rejected knowledge, the detritus from the Enlightenment. And there are different opinions about that. What is that really the best way of thinking about esotericism, as this trash bin, or should we be essentializing it and thinking of it as these collections of disparate currents like alchemy and astrology and black magic and so forth? So yeah, I think we have been getting a resurgence of esotericism. I think it's a really new field altogether, and it's just spawned out of the great plurality of currents that were floating around in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, I was going to say, when you brought up the New Age thing, it does seem that a lot of people who were involved in, are involved in New Age stuff, which I tend to really loathe, either get bored of it and just go back to living normally because it doesn't really help them very much, or they graduate and they look a bit deeper. And I'm thinking, like, Greer always makes a joke out of it. I'm sure Greer will probably come up a lot in this interview. Greer always makes a joke of Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, which had that sort of brief super popularity, and then you look into it and it's just sort of affirmations and positive thinking. Yeah, New Age thought clothed again in a different sort of garb.
Like Mary Baker Eddy repackaged, which is funny because that's what fuels Trump, that kind of thinking.
Yeah, Norman Vincent Peale, Power of Positive Thinking. It's exactly the same thing. But yeah, it's always there and it's always repackaged, and it's nice to see people actually interested in. You go, well, hang on, this has already been spoken about way back by there's a million names for the same thing. But moving on from there, this is the first time with two guests on the show for the Hermitix question. But so I think maybe what I'll do is say, I'm sure you both know the question. You can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room. Listen in on the conversation. Who would you pick? I think what we'll do is each of you pick your 3, unless you've done 3 for both of you, but either way is fine. But if you both pick 3, we'll eventually have a room of 6 and see what happens there. So maybe start with Dan. Who would your 3 be?
All right. So my question is, can fictional characters be admitted?
Well, one of the first times I ever did this question, Nick Land put 5 hyperdimensional lemurs in the room. So at this point, anything goes.
Excellent. Okay. So I think that my 3 people would probably be Jesus Christ, mm-hmm. Lao Tzu, mm-hmm. and Conan the Barbarian.
Okay.
Because I think that would really be the kind of like holy trinity of antitheses.
And I had the thought of splitting the question into dead people and living people. On the dead side, we would have Frederick II Hohenstaufen, John Dee, and Giordano Bruno. Mm-hmm. And among the living people, it would be John Michael Greer, Dmitry Orlov, and James Howard Bunzler.
Okay. So with the first 3 from Dan, in what sense do you see them as sort of antitheses of each other?
Well, I think like Conan and Jesus are really polar opposite ways of thinking, right? That they have very different approaches to reality. Mm-hmm. One smashes and doesn't ask for forgiveness. The other one only smashes righteously and is all about forgiveness. and they have very different ideas about, love and compassion and what makes a thriving world. And so these are they're the pagan and the Christian antitheses. They're just incommensurable ways of looking at the world. And then we have Lao Tzu, who would essentially try to strike up a balance or see the tension at work in some sort of holistic fashion. And I'd be interested to see how that plays itself out. Okay.
And then, David, you'll have to forgive me. So you had Bruno and...
so I had Friedrich Hohenstaufen, Frederick II, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, based in Sicily. We have John Dee and Giordano Bruno.
Okay. What's the...
All three of whom, their thinking is basically perpendicular to just about everyone else at their time. And having them all knowing also that they could actually all speak with each other, all of them knew Latin, is encouraging. So they could actually realistically interact if they could all be put in the same room. And because their thinking is well off the beaten track of their time period, I reckon that some interesting sparks might result.
Mm-hmm. I think Bruno would probably be the sort of outstanding one there, though, right?
Oh, in terms of the
character.
Perpendicularity, yes.
Oh,
definitely.
no, I mean in terms of character.
Oh, yeah. Also, he's a very colorful individual. Managed to make enemies just about everywhere he went, and stubborn, very much to his own detriment, ultimately. And in that trio, Dee strikes me as the more tragic figure whose life's work kind of evaporated or slipped between his fingers as time went on, despite being very high profile behind the scenes at the Elizabethan court and so on. And Frederick Hohenstaufen is just a remarkable character all around in terms of practicing experimental science himself, writing treatises while ruling the Holy Roman Empire from Sicily, no less. He knew the wine was better, I'm sure.
And your live room, is this just a fascination with claps, or why would you want Greer, Orlov, and Kunstler?
Oh, because their thinking is also perpendicular to what's going on in everything you see in the mainstream at the moment. And I know that at least two of them have been in the same room before. Perhaps different pairs of them have been in the same room, but I don't think all three have been in the same.
They have. I can link you. It's an amazing, super rare, 2.5 hour conversation, which is a video with Greer, Orlov, Kunstler, Chris Martenson.
Wow.
And one other collapse expert, and it's like the most interesting conversation I've ever listened to. It's fantastic.
I would really appreciate receiving that, I have to say, because what I'm wishing for has apparently already happened, and if Chris Martenson is part of the team as well, my goodness.
I got Conan Barbarian in there.
Exactly.
But if we were to think on the six, so if we had Lao Tzu, Jesus, and then Bruno D and Frederick as well, is there anything you two would sort of see in that dynamic?
Well, probably a bunch of people would team up with Jesus from that group, and they would probably wage some kind of war against Conan the Barbarian.
I'm pretty sure that Lao Tzu and Frederick would exchange tactics and strategies.
That's Sun Tzu.
I'm confused.
Lao Tzu is the author of the Tao Te Ching, whereas Sun Tzu is the author of the Art of War.
Fair enough. I sit corrected.
Okay. I'm sure that of these 9 figures, many will come back in. But just to begin, where can we situate the Picatrix historically?
Well, there are 2 phases we have to think about, essentially. The first phase being in the 10th century, during the time of its composition by Maslama al-Qurtubi. So 954 to 959 is when it was composed. And really our story as translators of the Latin, that begins in the mid-13th century. And that's around 1250.
1256 to 58, depending on what calculation of dates you want to use, because in the prologue to the Picatrix itself, there's a paragraph describing the dates, and if one tries to triangulate between those various date reckoning schemes, one ends up with a 2-year range in our BC AD time reckoning. 1256 to 58 is when the translation is said to claims itself to have been produced from Arabic into Spanish, Castilian Spanish, at the court of Alfonso X, Alfonso el Sabio, the Wise. And from there, it gets translated into Latin shortly thereafter, but definitely by 1300, because some of the interpolations, the bits of text that are added into the Latin but are absent from the Arabic, are present, were inserted approximately in 1300 in Montpellier, southern France, and which means that the Latin text has to have been already existing by then for these bits to be added.
So, as translators, do you think, as it's had this sort of long lineage of translations being handed to different people, being translated by different people, do you think potentially that something's been lost? Do we have the absolute original?
Yes, we have various manuscripts in the Arabic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And right now, Liana Saif is the one collecting those various manuscripts and creating a critical edition and translation. And so there are lots of various manuscripts floating around in the Arabic, and even those have differences among them. And so they have to be all reconciled into one giant critical edition. So really there is no archetypal, pure, there never is, pure text.
It's extremely rare, in fact, to find an author's autograph version. What I mean by autograph is the text written in the author's own hand, surviving from the Middle Ages. There's a handful of Thomas Aquinas that survives in that form, but as soon as you go prior to the year 1000 or so, that's if there's any, I'm not aware of them. And so, and the same applies to Arabic texts, and the Arabic manuscripts of the Picatrix we have all post-date the author's life by a fair bit. And for the Latin version, the distance is even more extreme in that the earliest manuscripts we have of the Latin Picatrix date to the 1450s, whereas the text itself is known to have been established by 1300. And in fact, there are very few, if any, references to the Picatrix in Latin literature from the composition of the text until the 1450s. So it's like there's this 150-year gap of no acknowledgement of it, but the text has to have been around for copies to have been made in the 1450s.
Right. And that's to say nothing of the fact that the Latin edition has a bunch of things added to it and a bunch of things removed from it, making it, not a completely different work. There are significant portions of overlap.
Yeah, it's recognizable as the same text, but it's different in very substantial ways.
Yes.
And one mustn't forget the Spanish intermediary between the two, which survives only in very fragmentary form. There's only a handful of pages that confirm that it belongs as an intermediary step. And one can infer from the surviving fragment of Spanish that the Latin resembles the Spanish much more than it resembles the Arabic.
Mm-hmm. So do we have any inclination as to the author or potential authors?
Of the original Arabic or of the Latin, do you mean?
Well, both. If I mean, in terms of who originally wrote it, do we have any inclination of that?
So traditionally, people have been ascribing this to one Maslama al-Majriti in the 11th century, but that's been proven by Maribel Fierro to be incorrect. That's actually an attribution that began with Ibn Khaldun, of all people. But the true author is Maslama al-Qurtubi, and so the Cordoban. And he was known by his contemporaries as a man of many charms and talismans. And he's a very mysterious figure. He was known as what we can call essentially an occultist, a botanist, somebody who deals in hidden matters. And he was a philosopher. Ultimately, that's how he perceived himself, was as somebody who was doing natural philosophy.
And there's some debate as to whether, and some people call al-Qurtubi a compiler, others call him an author when it comes to the Hayat al-Hakim, which is the Arabic original it translates as the goal of the sage, which is the Arabic title of the Picatrix. And he is compiling material from, he said in the book itself says, from 224 different sources. But they're arranged in a very specific way that betrays intent on the author, on al-Qurtubi's part. And my personal view is that I would drive sort of halfway between those two designations and call it a very carefully curated compilation. And I'm still willing to call him an author because the curation justifies it.
Yeah, and he's not just hodgepodge mixing stuff together. He's creating a very comprehensive system that is not self-evident from just reading cover to cover. You really have to have some sort of background or training in the various traditions that comprise the various practices, especially astrology, right? There's a lot of a priori astrological knowledge that you need to have before you come to the Picatrix. And the same with arguably alchemy and plant lore and these, maybe not alchemy, but definitely a knowledge of metals and a knowledge of minerals and plants and so forth.
Yeah, the plants are a big thing. The Al-Qurtubi wrote a sibling volume to this called the Rutbat al-Hakim, which is the rank of the sage. And just as the Picatrix deals with astral magic, the Rutbat al-Hakim does the same for earth-based magic, i.e. alchemy.
I suppose we should say right off the bat what the Picatrix is.
Good point.
For people who are familiar with it. It is a magician's handbook, an astral magician's handbook on how to perform astral magic, which is usually performed through the construction of talismans or images. So these can be figurines or statues or sigils, and they are made at the correct astrological hours under the right configurations of the planets. And these then pour down their influences, their rays or their spirits into these talismans. And then they become repositories of that snapshot of time. And that can have power that can be then carried over into other times. And so really this was, we think of this as magic, but for them, this was the height of philosophy. This was employing all of the branches of the 7 liberal arts and using them in order to effect change in the world using science.
I should add the postscript that the Rutbat al-Hakim, the rank of the sage, the sister volume on alchemy, was never translated into Latin, and so is broadly speaking unknown in the West, unlike the Picatrix.
Is there any plans to translate it?
I don't know. One would have to create an edition of it. I don't think that the Rutbat al-Hakim has even seen print in Arabic.
Wow.
So and there's it's not the only book of its kind that hasn't seen print. I mean, there's a whole lot of scholarship that needs to be done on the Arabic Middle Ages. So it's a rich field. It's a rich field. I should mention, I guess, as well, that there has the Hayat al-Hakim, the Arabic Picatrix, has seen print in the late 20s and early 30s through work at the Warburg Institute, but they did not have access to all of the manuscripts that are known to be extant of the text, and so that's why Liana Saif has felt the need to start working on it, and her work has progressed a fair bit at this point, from what I gather.
Oh yeah, it's almost done. It's just that new manuscripts keep popping up, and so every time a new manuscript pops up, it's like, oh, I have to get to this place somehow, to this collection somehow, and then compare everything I've written to this new manuscript. So it's like I've got to reread the Picatrix every single time a manuscript comes up, and not just read it, like really letter by letter, scan it very cautiously. As far as our work is concerned with the Latin edition, that kind of critical edition work was done by David Pingree, who is a real legend in the field of astrology or the history of mathematics and astrology. And I don't know if you have anything to say on David Pingree, but he's a fairly important figure in this whole story.
His work on Arabic mathematics and Arabic astrology is almost peripheral to his main task, which was the cataloging of Sanskrit astrological manuscripts in India. And he would tell tales of his manuscript hunting expeditions in India that are absolutely daunting as compared to even to the quantity of Latin manuscripts that survive. There's 2 orders of magnitude more in terms of quantity of Sanskrit stuff that is just sitting in libraries in India, unedited, unprinted, and the climate in India isn't auspicious for the long-term survival of these things because from what David Pingree was telling me, the traditions of copying these manuscripts in the temples has sort of fallen by the wayside in the last couple of centuries. And the average lifespan of a manuscript in India in that climate is precisely a couple of centuries. So there's a lot of work, a mountain of work to be done there. So for anyone who is very good at reading Sanskrit manuscripts, there's they know if they have that skill, they know how much work they have to do.
Yeah. You mentioned, just to jump back, you mentioned it's compiled from sort of 200 sources. Yeah. Maybe I'm on the wrong track here, but are any of these sources, would they be familiar to anyone?
Oh, definitely. Most of them are, and they span quite a wide range. I mean, Al-Qurtubi in his youth traveled a great deal across the Mediterranean. He was from Spain, but the Arab world encompassed the entire southern and eastern side of it. So his sources are Egyptian, they are Arabic, they are Babylonian, they are Persian, they are Indian, they are Nabatean, in addition to being to the Greek material. It appears as though the Latin world wasn't prominent enough at the time to justify any inclusion, it seems. There's very little to do with the Latin world in this text. So his extensive travels led him to collect all of these sources, and late in his life, apparently by the time he was already blind, he pulled together and presumably dictated the Picatrix, as we see it, or the Hayat al-Hakim at the very least.
He cites his own sources.
Most of the time.
Yeah, like he I think takes pride in the fact that he has used so many books, and he wants you to know that he read Ibn Washia, he read Ptolemy, he read Abu Mashar, he read all kinds of different authors. Thabit ibn Qurra, the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, which is a collection of works. So he did want you to know that he was working from a tradition and from a real wide range of stuff. And so that is how we can retrace essentially what he was doing.
I mean, he's pulling together a fairly internally consistent system out of very disparate sources, all things considered. Which is an impressive feat, and I guess in that sense justifies the attribution of authorship to him.
Right, but he didn't invent the system.
No, he certainly didn't.
So there are, for example, if you read another work that was popular in the Arabic world called The Secret of Secrets, which is cited in the Picatrix, and it is a dialogue between Alexander and Aristotle. And Aristotle is teaching Alexander all of these basically tips on how to rule a kingdom. But near the end of this, part of being this great ruler is the capacity to do magic. And so there is instruction on how to build certain talismans, and that is essentially the same kind of magic that is appearing in the Picatrix.
So when you say it's based on a traditions and there's a system, do you mean something other than sort of, is there an affiliation there with, say, Hermeticism or Gnosticism? Are we dealing with one of these systems, or did you mean something else entirely?
It's really complicated.
Yeah. It's at the intersection of the Neoplatonic hierarchy of being and how it's thought to work, and Al-Kindi's theory of rays and how it was thought to work, and the whole theory of sympathetic correspondences between things fits into the system, and it's never described in a way that would be satisfying to a modern sort of systematic thinker. Because you have to pull together bits and pieces from a whole bunch of different places to sort of imagine the coherent system that seems to lurk behind all of the details as they're sprinkled throughout the Picatrix.
Yeah, if I really had to simplify it, and this is painfully simplifying it, I would call it pseudo-Aristotelian. But the problem is that using the term pseudo-Aristotelian, you don't do that to preclude Platonism. It includes Platonism, or at least Platonism as received in the Arabic world. And so, there are Platonic currents, there are Aristotelian currents, there are Stoic currents, and then there are indigenous Egyptian and Babylonian currents through Ibn Washia, for example. And he's really drawing all of these different currents together and showing how this is what the ancient sages used to do. That's really his guiding light, is the ancient sages of India, the ancient sages of Babylon, the ancient sages of the Greek world. They really had a knowledge. They were perfected in their understanding, and therefore they could perform astral magic because they were just one with the active intellect, so to speak.
So when, in relation to these sages, when the Picatrix refers to God, it would be referring to the God of these sages?
So the God of the Hayat al-Hakim is very unambiguously Allah. It's the God of Islam. And once it moves over to Christianity, it becomes very clearly the Christian God, but no reference to the Holy Spirit or Christ. So there's no real Trinitarian rehashing over, which is somewhat surprising, I think. There's like in the year of our Lord or references like that, but there's no reference to Jesus or any kind of Christian. There are some Christian edits.
Yes. The Christianity or the Christian audience of the Picatrix manifests in terms of the bits of the Hayat al-Hakim that were cut out by its translators into Spanish and then Latin. Those bits that were most explicit about referring to the Quran, for example, are the things that get excised.
Yeah, or there's one ritual which is basically a date rape ritual. Yes. For summoning making a young girl come to your house and stay with you. But in the Arabic version, it's a young boy. So there was some element of homosexuality that was okay in the Islamic world that did not sit well with the Christian world at the time.
Wow. Okay. It's pretty strange that the ritual's still okay. We just have to change whether it's a boy or a girl.
Yeah. The question of whether things is okay or not is a whole other can of worms, because that's like every single person is has a different idea of what is okay. And even the people who think it's not okay, they might think, well, I can read it. I know how to read this without becoming corrupted by it, but other people should totally not read it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The references to secrecy and not letting this text fall into the wrong hands are repeated very frequently throughout the Picatrix. And it's not uncommon for this genre of text, of compiled magical rituals, to have these kinds of warnings. And the Picatrix itself is very careful to present itself as a work, as the culmination of the sciences and of philosophy, rather than a text that deserves opprobrium. And yet, when one looks into the rituals, some of them are quite distasteful.
Yeah,
as we've just discussed.
Because on the one hand, you're theoretically dealing with these Platonic celestial intelligences that are discussed in, say, the Timaeus. And these, in that form, seem kind of neutered. But in reality, when these are hooked up with their actual pagan god forms, like Saturn or Mars or whatever, they have sacrifices to them, and they become more colored by their pagan coloring, which within a Christian and Islamic context would be a bit problematic. But that's again, it depends. When we say problematic, we're saying problematic to who. And, Islam was never a hegemonic power in the time period of Al-Qurtubi. So you can't, there are ways to fall through the cracks, so to speak, and avoid getting in trouble. Or perhaps that kind of magic was not even really seen with that much distaste. It was practiced by doctors and physicians, and it really depends. What comes about in the Christian world especially is a distinction between the good magic and the bad magic. So even the Picatrix, let's say Ficino, splits Picatrix up and says, look, we have the good stuff, which is the making gold talismans to cure your kidney stones. We have Saturnine life extension rings, things like this. This is good. This is medicine. But there are rituals in the Picatrix where we have to summon the spirits of Saturn, and we have to do sacrifices to them by killing animals and burning certain incenses at the correct astrological hours. And in this, we're certainly doing idolatrous and abominable behavior from the perspective of a medieval mendicant monk or priest or something like that.
Another sign of the hazards associated with the Picatrix is that it never saw print until the 20th century. And yet 17 or so complete manuscripts survive of it from roughly 1450 to 16 something. So it was popular enough to be copied multiple times, but no one wanted to associate their name with it in terms of a printed edition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we know many people, Cornelius Agrippa, Pico della Mirandola, they had copies. That doesn't mean that they accepted everything in the Picatrix at face value, but they definitely recognized it. It was part of philosophy at the time.
As far as I'm aware, Ficino is the only author who comes anywhere close to praising it. Everyone else has bad things to say about it.
Well, even Ficino doesn't really praise it.
Well, yeah, but
he never names it, and when he does, it's in a private letter.
That's true.
And he's recommending not to use it because he's saying everything that is of good and of worth, I've copy pasted it into my De Vita Libri Tres. And so all of the barbarous and idolatrous material, that stuff, you don't need that stuff, so don't worry about it. It hasn't been transferred.
It's funny you mentioned the fact the warning is mentioned loads of times, though, because this is something that's come up with John Michael Greer, actually, a couple of times. And I think I can see why when temperaments are different, back, way back, that these warnings are going to be there. But nowadays, because people would say, well, hang on, now you've taken this book which is warned against repeatedly and you've published it, literally, you could just buy a copy and have it the next day, And Greer always states that people forget that magic takes a lot of work. So my argument with the warning sign thing is that the kind of people who are going to be reading these books in that serious manner probably would have really tried to sort them out, seek them out wherever anyway. So I think that warning thing is always a bit silly.
Injunctions to secrecy are like the sine qua non of esotericism.
Yeah.
And the idea is if you were to just give something to somebody right away, they just wouldn't believe it, or they wouldn't accept it because they haven't done any work to acquire that knowledge. But if you veil something in many veils, you increase the value of the thing at the end of the line. And that is really, I think, the heart of esotericism. It is this constant seduction in order to get people to desire to learn and to know. And so I think it does seem a bit silly, but I think that it is a cornerstone of the genre is this initiatic character. That is what makes something hermetic. Hermeticism is the initiation between a master and a student. And it is that mode of discourse between who is it, Tat and Asclepius, or it's always this process of of leading people through these veils because they wouldn't value it if you just gave it to them up front.
And there's also the very practical side of the true hazards of some of the rituals here, wherein the ingredients involved, scopolamine and company, are truly hazardous. You really don't want to mess with this. And we actually include a warning in our own introduction that a lot of it is sure to be unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was one of Gurdjieff's clear points as well, is that he made it clear to his followers that you never appreciate anything which is given to you and you haven't had to work for or pay money for it.
He was a real master of that technique of setting up veils and creating kind of a depth where certainly there was one, but like that's part of the journey is the piercing through the veils.
That's what I was going to say as well, is the idea of a journey is like you can only have the journey yourself. So any conclusions, sort of like someone who's had the experience of climbing to the top of the mountain, if they just said to you or showed you a picture, said, here's the view, it's completely like never going to be the same thing as journeying up the mountain yourself. So I think the journey is the important thing. But as we're on the topic of warnings and danger, this book is still understood by many as, you mentioned the Picatrix. People think of sort of people in their basements clad in black robes, stood on a pentagram, the tomb of black magic. Is there, as we're speaking of warnings, is there any truth to this? Or is it,
I think
is this come from the Christian sort of sensibility?
Right now in today's day and age, certainly like Picatrix is just one more manual in magicians' toolkits. So it depends what kind of magic you're into. If you're into Solomonic Goetia, or if you're into strictly just astral magic, it depends. You would have a collection of works that you would work with, and in that regard, in this day and age, it is definitely associated with this sort of post-Crowley golden dawnification of magic. But I think prior to, if we're talking about the medieval ages, the people who were mostly looking at this stuff were clerics. Christian clerics were the literate people, and the people who were involved in learned magic were literate people. And so that's how we know about these works. They survived because they were kept in monastery libraries, and sometimes they were excised and stuffed into other works in order to maybe defang them a little bit. Or if you have this work on talismans and maybe it's stuffed in a book on astronomy, then it might seem a little bit more neutral than if you just had this standalone work on talismans.
And there's certain places that are known to have been hotbeds of interest in the esoterica in the Middle Ages. St. Augustine's Monastery at Canterbury comes to mind, where a friend and colleague of ours at University of London published a book on exactly that place and the magical texts contained therein. Her name is Sophie Page. And her book is in the Magic and History series, in fact.
Yeah, Magic in the Cloister.
That's the one.
And that library became John Dee's library, his personal library. That became the largest library in England for quite some time. And yeah, so there was a negative association in the sense that there is some sort of flirtation with idolatry. There is flirtation with, you're dealing with body parts, but also I think medieval people were probably a lot less squeamish than we are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The noxious substances.
Yeah.
The hazardous materials that are especially plant matter, that is to be burned in close quarters and inhaled and so on. 8 ounces of opium is going to get you far.
Right. But in terms of the nefarious character,
right,
and the nefarious aesthetic of the Picatrix, it is both there and it is both not there. It was not intended to be that way. It was intended to be the height of religion and philosophy and science. And it is in its received form that it's taken on this more nefarious image.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a majority of the rituals in the text that aim at harmful ends. They are there somewhere between a quarter and a third of the rituals, and the intent of the rituals it aims for at harm of some sort, which means the majority of it is beneficial, but the harmful aspects are present. and they're undeniable.
Yeah, they're like destroying cities or ruining marriages or
making
this kind of thing.
Either keeping people imprisoned or causing them to escape.
Mm-hmm. Is there any documentation of people using this for, malevolent aims? Or is there any documentation of, maybe...
There are Christians like Johannes Hartley decrying the use of the Picatrix, saying that, it's bitter poisons mixed in with sweet words. And there are other people like Rabelais saying, he calls Picatrix the rector of the diabolical faculty. So we get a bunch of little references here. Even Victor Hugo talks about Esmeralda's goat being knowledgeable of mathematics like Picatrix. So you get these little hints that pop up, and it's never really direct anything. And I think that also has to do with the fact that, again, Picatrix is just one book, and a magician would presumably have a collection of them. And there's no reason why you would single out Picatrix in your discussions of condemning a magician.
Yeah, there's a quote from 1897 by the Reverend J. Wood Brown saying that it's to be hoped that the Picatrix may never be translated into any modern language.
And I think a lot of this has to do with the cross-pollination with Solomonic magic, right? Which it is not. It is not the same kind of demonic magic. There are many magicians today who mix the systems, but in origin, these are two very different traditions.
Could you differentiate them?
Oh, sure. I mean, one is based on summoning, for example, the 72 Dukes of Hell or the Demons of Solomon. And this is much later. This stuff comes much later than Picatrix by about 600 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, as compared to Hayat al-Hakim, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas one is dealing with celestial intelligences, which are spirits or ruhaniyat that are connected to the planets, which themselves, they've got sight and they have senses. It was debated among the philosophers of the Islamic world how many senses they had, but nonetheless, they were sensate beings, and they had retinues of spirits that accompanied them, and those could be placated to redirect the rays that constitute the material world, and various sacrifices and plants, and when you sacrifice an animal or if you burn a plant, you are releasing some of these rays or spirits back into the universal matrix of rays, and thereby creating various configurations that alter reality. And these are learned, right? These are things that are passed down from generation to generation through various ancient sages. And so the Picatrix is very much a collection of these things. And a lot of them are pseudepigraphically attributed. So Plato did this teleportation ritual, or walk on water, or flight, or something like that. So it's often pseudepigraphically attributed philosophers, and who to us, we don't think about these figures as being magicians, but certainly in the Arab world in the 10th century, they did.
Okay. One sort of big question for me is because I think a lot of magic, at least, definitely after Crowley, is understood in relation to the will. The magician's will, the sorcerer's will, whatever it may be. Is there a different understanding of this within the Picatrix?
No, the Picatrix, I think, is a real big part of this that has not been very much discussed. The will is very important, and explicitly so in the Picatrix, that, prayers and rituals and stuff like that, they don't work if the will is not attendant on them.
Yeah, the doubt is antithetical to the success of these magical operations, and the Picatrix is explicit about saying so.
Yes. And so the will is a big part of it. And then once that goes into the Christian world, it certainly upsets and I would say this is not just Picatrix. This would be a bunch of books like The Secret of Secrets as well. And what they do is they bring into question free will. If everything is astrally determined by these celestial intelligences, then what purpose does free will have? And how, for example, do these celestial rays affect the development of things like religions? Are religions above celestial influences, or are they the product of them? Because Abu Mashar, definitely a student of Al-Kindi, definitely thought that they were. But later on, people like Roger Bacon, they took up these ideas and recapitulated them. But Pico della Mirandola in the Renaissance, he vehemently denies this connection. He says that, magic has nothing, or celestial influences from astrology have nothing to do with religion. And look at all of these astrologers predicting all of these things about religion. And look, their calculations are wrong. And, oh, look, they predicted that Christianity would end in 1460, but here we are in the 1490s. So definitely in the Christian world, the will became very important because the will is fundamental to Augustinian theology. It's fundamental in the Neoplatonic cosmology, it's fundamental in Augustinian Catholicism, and therefore it becomes fundamental in the Latin West. And that really then gets carried on in through the Enlightenment and on into Crowley's day. And I think of Crowley very much as a theoretician of the will, above all. Mm-hmm. And I think that Picatrix definitely played a part in that story that is not often praised. And that is probably in part because Picatrix was not known to Crowley. He could not have known about it. And it just had not been rediscovered yet. So the kind of magic that he was involved with, it was downstream from the Picatrix.
Okay. That leads to the question then, is there a teleology for the practitioner of the Picatrix, or is this solely a handbook for sort of individual aims of, the present, like what I need now, right? I want to...
So there is definitely a teleology. The whole book is called The Goal of the Sage. Mm-hmm. So like that, the Aristotelian teleology is fundamentally rooted into the whole structure of the system, because you are supposed to become perfected in the 7 liberal arts. And then once you've accomplished that, then you sort of break through into the ability to wield magic. And once you can do that, then you will perform your ritual of perfect nature. And when you perform the ritual of the perfect nature, you summon your higher genius, your, in Thelemic terms, your holy guardian angel, which is, a later term, but that is more or less what it is. It is that Platonic daimon or higher genius that you communicate with. And it is both you and it is both not you. And that is your perfect self, your perfect nature. And so the whole point of the Picatrix is to come into contact with your perfect nature and become a perfected human being like the ancient sages were.
And only once you've achieved that can you achieve success in the rituals that accompany these theoretical expositions.
Okay. So does it state whether or not it's bad to sort of use the Picatrix, willy-nilly, without this sort of will towards perfection?
If you try to operate without the proper preparation, your rituals simply won't work, according to the Picatrix.
Yeah.
Unless you've achieved your perfect nature, the rest of it is it will arrive to naught.
Yeah, and this became actually debated later on in, again, the Christian world with a figure like Petrus Alfonsi, who wrote the Disciplina Clericalis, where he's talking about various debates about the 7 liberal arts and what is the highest liberal art. And he says, some people think philosophy is the highest liberal art, but then others who are wicked people, they think that nigromancia is the highest liberal art. And that is very much the Spanish term for black magic, or astral magic in this case.
Okay, so what are the preparations?
So, well, there are many, and often they involve purification, like not having any dirt on your clothes kind of purification, because presumably that if one kind of metal or stone is favorable to the planet that you are conjuring, then you don't want to have dust on you, which could have particles of antithetical stones, of antithetical substances. So you make sure that you are ritually purified. You have to select the right hours. That's really the core of it. So, knowledge in astrology is the sine qua non of the whole operation. You just can't do anything without calculating the right astrological hours. And then usually there are instructions for any given spell, and they involve the construction of talismans or making of images, and then sometimes putting those images places, or sometimes suffumigating those images while they hang on a tin cross.
So there's one example of that.
So those are the talismanic operations, but then there are also the invocatory, addressative type operations, which are not real. I think some people nowadays, they mix them together into one thing. But in the Picatrix, they seem to be kind of separate, where the invoking of the planetary intelligences, like the spirit of Saturn or the spirit of Jupiter, that stuff is its own kind of magic. And that is more like, this is what the ancient pagans or ancient sages used to do. And I, myself, Al-Qurtubi, I don't recommend that you do this. I merely pass it along because this is what the ancient sages would do. But he definitely recommends you do talismanic astral magic.
Yeah. Some other aspects of purity that are involved, sometimes we see injunctions for fasting as well as for sexual purity. So abstaining from sexual activity in a certain period prior to producing the ritual.
Yeah, everything is very contingent on specific rituals.
Yeah,
there isn't really like a one size fits all way of getting prepared for an operation. It seems that different spells require different components, and there's not like a blanket preparation system.
Okay. Is there any? Would you say there's any contemporary equivalents to the Picatrix? I mean, I would think much when I was reading it. Much of it actually reminded me of Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages, except Manly P. Hall basically cites nothing at all. Do you think there's any contemporary sort of attempts to recreate something along these lines?
Well, having pulled together the index to the Picatrix, I can say that it felt a lot like trying to index the famous cookbook, The Joy of Cooking, especially the earlier editions that have extensive discussions of the background to cooking, which is the butchering of the animal and the preparation of the meat and this kind of thing, as a sort of metaphor for what the Picatrix does in terms of astral magic, where you have bits of theory that then are followed by a bunch of recipes that include a huge variety of ingredients and so on. So in terms of structure and layout, it's most reminiscent to me of The Joy of Cooking. But conceptually, that's a different story.
Okay. So we're in to about an hour now. Is there anything sort of, as two people on Earth who've probably spent more time with this book than basically most people ever will, is there anything you'd like to add in that you think is commonly missed out in such conversations as these about the Picatrix? I know that's a huge question, because I'm sure there's a lot we've sort of missed out, but.
Well, we've touched on quite a bit in this discussion, I would say, in terms of the warnings about the toxicity of and potential hazards associated with some of the rituals for very practical and verifiable reasons. Henbane and hemlock are toxic, and there are multiple rituals that call for both. And there's a whole bunch of other
lead
and so on, neurologically active ingredients in this that are to be manipulated. Unless it's done very, very carefully, and unless you have the right background knowledge to know this, it will be hazardous. You will cause harm, probably to yourself in the manipulation, and possibly to anyone around you, because not all the rituals are solitary in this text. There's a handful of ones that require other people. Dan, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I don't know. It is a bit of a broad question, so it's difficult for me to think off the cuff.
I guess the awareness of the multiple steps in producing this text is helpful in terms of sort of a general warning of not taking it as an absolute, that what is in anyone's hands when they have our translation of the Picatrix is the result of many of the text going through many hands and many minds before reaching this stage. And one could take any given chunk of it and trace it backward through from our text to Pingree's edition, to the various manuscripts that he used, to the original translators in the late 13th century, to the translator of the Spanish version, and then all the way back to Al-Qurtubi himself and the various manuscripts of the Arabic in the meantime too. So that not to treat it as a sacred text, and in fact what I'm saying applies, I suppose, to all texts that date back multiple centuries, because they all go through a similar kind of process. This one more than others, to be fair, because of the multilingual stages that it went through.
Yeah, I think I do know what something to take away is that Picatrix is a chapter in the history of science. It is a chapter in the history of medicine, and it is a chapter in the history of philosophy, just as much as it is a chapter in the history of magic. And, often it's called the Hermetic work, and that is true to some extent, but it is just as Hermetic as it is Aristotelian, as it is Platonic, as it is Jabirian, as it is Ibn Washian. So these kinds of categories don't help much. But it's important to think about how systems of knowledge were developed over centuries, and how different ideas about science and what science was meant for and what was the driving goal of science. These kinds of things have changed significantly. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it has not always been this way. And a book like Picatrix really is like a paradigm shift. It really helps you think about how different the paradigm you live in now is from the one in the 9th century.
It's a very good point there. And it's from a different paradigm, and you sort of have to mentally put yourself within that different paradigm in order to understand truly what's going on in the Picatrix, as well as any other books of its within its genre.
Yeah, and of course there are things to learn from that paradigm, right? It's not just this objective anthropologist kind of attitude. There are things, I think, that science in our day and age, there are elements of science in our day and age that I think are severely lacking, where I think in the 10th century they had a much more holistic picture of what science was for.
I think that seems to be sort of a good place to finish up.